What to do about ISIS is a non-trivial question, but it is of far less significance than others that have for too long gone largely ignored. To wit, does waging war across a large swath of the Islamic world make sense? Is that war winnable in any meaningful sense? And if not, why are we there? I wanted to move this up a little bit closer to you, if it moves. Nope, it's done. Nope, I'll pull out the plug. Okay, can't. Maybe I could have you all stand up and move closer to me. Well, thanks for the kind introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. I am going to talk to you about my new book that came out in April, America's War for the Greater Middle East, and I've been bouncing around the country, and I'm on the radio trying to get people to notice. You know, it's hard work writing a book. It's actually even harder work trying to get somebody to notice that you've written a book so that they'll buy a couple of copies. But if you'll have an opportunity to do that when we're done, I'll be glad to sign it and chat for a while. Everywhere I have spoken while promoting this book, I get asked the following question during the Q&A part. So, smart guy, what do you recommend we should do about ISIS? And I have to say, in some respects, the purpose of the book is to suggest that that's the wrong question. And in a way, I'm reminded of the situation that we, the United States, faced back in the latter part of 1967 and early 1968, when at that time, the question of the moment was, can Khe-Sanh hold? And some of you, some of us older folks, will remember that Khe-Sanh was a Marine garrison located in the very northern part of South Vietnam. And two North Vietnamese divisions had those Marines completely surrounded, the Marines being greatly outnumbered by the enemy. Press commentary at the time drew comparisons between Khe-Sanh in 1967 and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu back in 1954. Then, back in 1954, a besieged and outnumbered French garrison had fallen to the Viet Minh, and that defeat had doomed the French effort to hang on to Indochina. So was this history about to repeat itself at Khe-Sanh? Well, as many of you know, in the event, Khe-Sanh did hold, and the United States lost the war anyway. So in retrospect, it seems pretty clear that back in 1967 and 1968, we were asking the wrong question. Rather than focusing on the fate of the garrison at Khe-Sanh, the American public might have been asking questions such as these. Does the Vietnam War make sense? Is it winnable? If not, why are we there? And does no alternative exist to simply pressing on with a policy that was showing no signs of success? And I believe today that we find ourselves in really a comparable situation. What to do about ISIS is a non-trivial question, but it is of far less significance than others that have for too long gone largely ignored. To wit, does waging war across a large swath of the Islamic world make sense? Is that war winnable in any meaningful sense? And if not, why are we there? Is there no alternative? So my book provides an account of America's war in the Greater Middle East with the aim of drawing attention to these more fundamental questions. And the book suggests that before answering the ISIS question, we should consider how we got to where we are today, which necessarily requires evaluating U.S. military efforts in this region, evaluating what U.S. military efforts in this region have yielded and at what cost. So the book tells a story of what has become an immense enterprise, a war for the Greater Middle East that began in 1980 and is still underway today, 36 years later. Well, why cite 1980 as the start point for my narrative? Because in January of that year, President Jimmy Carter, no doubt the least bellicose president that we've had in the past half-century, but in January of 1980, President Jimmy Carter used the occasion of his State of the Union address to designate the Persian Gulf a vital U.S. national security interest. In layperson's language, a place that the United States now deemed worth fighting for. This Carter Doctrine, as it came to be known, touched off the process of militarizing U.S. policy, not only in the Persian Gulf, but across much of the Islamic world, eventually landing the United States in a state of open-ended war. So my narrative unfolds chronologically. It begins with the failed Iran hostage rescue attempt of 36 years ago in April of 1980, and the narrative concludes with the now renewed Gulf War, by my count, the fourth Gulf War in which the United States has been engaged in the last 4 decades. I say that the book concludes, the narrative concludes, but of course the conflict that the book describes does not conclude. And we can surely expect, sadly, we can expect that there will be more campaigns to come. Along the way, the book tries to answer 4 questions. First, what has motivated the United States to act as it has? Second, what have the civilians responsible for formulating policy and the soldiers charged with implementing policy sought to accomplish? Third, regardless of their intentions, what actually ensued? And fourth, with what consequences? In short, the book links aims to actions to outcomes. The central theme of my story can be briefly stated. A nation priding itself in having the world's greatest military, and we certainly do have the world's greatest military, has misused its military power on an epic scale. It's not simply that we have not prevailed, although obviously we have not. Rather, through a combination of naivete, short-sightedness, and hubris, we've actually made matters worse, at least in my judgment, at very considerable cost to ourselves and to others. Well, what has this war been about? In a narrow sense, it began as a war for oil. Yet even from the outset, much more was at stake than ensuring access to the cheap gas that fuels the American way of life. From day one, the larger purpose of America's war for the greater Middle East has been to affirm that we are a people to whom limits do not apply. In a sense, through a war that now extends well into the 21st century, the United States has sought to validate or affirm the apparent outcome of the 20th century. As enshrined in our collective memory, that outcome, the outcome of the 20th century, ostensibly testifies to American global preeminence, political, military, economic, cultural, and ideological. That memory of the 20th century, that interpretation of the 20th century, also asserts a claim to privileges, above all to freedom, abundance, and security. These define our birthright, so at least most Americans have come to believe. Well, starting with the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, both occurring in 1979, events in the greater Middle East have challenged such expectations. Following in their way came other developments, not least of all the 9/11 attacks, suggesting that the so-called American century might have been a fluke, or worse still, a fiction. The ultimate purpose of our war for the greater Middle East has been to refute any such suspicions. A demonstration of American military prowess, thereby extending the American century into the indefinite future. Nominally, to listen to our political leaders at least, the U.S. troops dispatched to invade, occupy, garrison, bomb, or raid various parts of the Islamic world since 1980 have sought to punish the wicked, protect the innocent, and spread liberal values. Their advertised purpose has been to liberate, defend, or deter. Yet their actual purpose, in my judgment, has been far more ambitious. The real mission has been to sustain the claims of American exceptionalism that have long since become central to our self-identity, to bring into compliance with American purposes the revolutionaries, warlords, terrorists, despots, or bad actors of various stripe given to defiance. To employ Washington-style jargon, back in 1980, the United States set out in willy-nilly fashion to shape the greater Middle East. Now, given the conditions existing there, employing military means to bring the region into conformity with American purposes has resulted in an undertaking breathtaking in scope. Over time, it has found U.S. forces in action everywhere from Iran and Iraq, Lebanon and Libya, Somalia and Sudan, Bosnia and Kosovo, Afghanistan and Pakistan. The list goes on. Indeed, the list continually gets longer. Along the way, we tried overwhelming force and shock and awe. We invaded, occupied, and took a stab at nation building. We experimented with counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, regime change and decapitation, peacekeeping and humanitarian intervention, retaliatory strikes and preventive attack, even something that the Air Force called air occupation. U.S. forces operated overtly, covertly, and through proxies. Almost certainly they went places and did things about which the American public today remains in the dark. Unfortunately, no administration ever devised a plausible strategy for achieving American aims. Each administration, in turn, has simply reacted to situations that it confronted. Nor, ironically, has any administration made available the means needed to make good on the grandiose ambitions that it entertained. Indeed, on the U.S. side, one of this conflict's abiding qualities has been its paltriness. On the home front, normalcy has prevailed throughout. Today, who can dispute the fact that the problems besetting the greater Middle East are substantially greater than they were when substantial numbers of U.S. forces first began venturing into the region? ISIS offering but one example of the results. And we may argue over the underlying sources of these problems, but there is no arguing that U.S. military efforts to alleviate the dysfunction so much in evidence have failed. To address the situation, facing the United States in the greater Middle East, there are really two, and speaking in very general terms, two plausible approaches available. The first approach is basically to wait things out, insulating yourself from the problem's worst effects while promoting a nonviolent solution from within. This approach requires patience and comes with no guarantee of ultimate success. And with all the usual caveats attached, it was this approach that the United States took during the Cold War. The second approach is more direct. The second approach aims to eliminate the problem through sustained and relentless military action. This approach entails less patience, but incurs greater near-term sacrifice. And after a certain amount of shilly-shallying, it was this head-on approach that the Union adopted during the Civil War in order to defeat the Confederacy. In its war for the greater Middle East, however, the United States has chosen neither to contain nor to crush. Instead, it has charted a course midway in between. In effect, it chose aggravation. With politicians and generals too quick to declare victory, and with the American public too quick to throw in the towel when faced with adversity, U.S. forces rarely stayed long enough to finish the job. And I say that even understanding that in Iraq and Afghanistan they stayed so long that those two conflicts ended up being the longest in our history. But instead of intimidating, U.S. military efforts have annoyed, incited, and generally communicated a lack of both competence and resolve. And then in the ultimate irony, the circumstances ostensibly making the Persian Gulf worth fighting for in the first place have ceased to pertain. If today the American way of life still depends, for better or worse, on having access to plentiful reserves of oil and natural gas, then defending Canada and Venezuela should take precedence over defending Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Even so, shorn of its initial rationale, the war for the Greater Middle East continues as if on autopilot. That the ongoing enterprise may someday end, that U.S. troops will finally come home, appears so unlikely as to make that prospect unworthy of discussion, even in a presidential election year. Like the war on drugs or the war on poverty, the war for the Greater Middle East has become a fixture in American life and is accepted as such. Well, among the factors contributing to the lack of any serious challenge to this war's perpetuation, I think 4 stand out. One factor is the absence of an anti-war or anti-interventionist political party worthy of the name. The ongoing war has long since acquired a perfidious approval of bipartisan approval, and as such, the 2 major parties are equally disinclined to probe too deeply into the war's origins, conduct, or prospects. A second reason for the war's perpetuation is that politicians aspiring to high office find it more expedient to support the troops, and therefore the war, than to question the war's efficacy. So candidates in every election since 1980 have avoided anything like a serious debate of U.S. military policy in the Islamic world. Yes, a particular campaign gone awry, like Somalia in 1993, or the occupation of Iraq after 2003, or the aftermath of the Libyan intervention of 2011, a particular campaign gone awry might attract attention, but never the context in which that campaign occurred. So the war for the Greater Middle East still awaits its Eugene McCarthy or its George McGovern. A third reason for the war's perpetuation, of course, is that some individuals and institutions actually benefit from an armed conflict that drags on and on. Those benefits are immediate and tangible. They come in the form of profits, jobs, and campaign contributions. For the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower correctly identified, and for the beneficiaries of the military-industrial complex, perpetual war is not necessarily bad news. Finally, there is this, fourth reason for this war's perpetuation. Thus far, at least, Americans themselves, we the people, appear oblivious to what is occurring, policymakers having successfully insulated the public from the war's negative consequences. In a fundamental sense, we have reached the conclusion that war is not our concern. But here's the rub, it seems to me. In the 21st century, the prerequisites of freedom, abundance, and security are birthright, we think. The prerequisites of freedom, abundance, and security are changing. Geopolitically, Asia is eclipsing in importance all other regions of the world, apart perhaps from North America itself. The emerging problem set, for example, coping with the effects of climate change, the emerging problem set is global and will require a global response. Whether Americans are able to preserve the privileged position to which they are accustomed will depend on how well the United States adapts itself to these fresh circumstances. No doubt, amid such challenges, the afflictions besetting large portions of the Islamic world will persist. But their relative importance to the United States as determinants of American well-being will diminish. And in this context, the war for the Greater Middle East becomes a diversion that Americans can ill afford. To fancy at this point that the United States military possesses the capacity to shape the course of events in that region is an absurdity. And indulging that absurdity further serves chiefly to impede the ability of the United States to attend to concerns that are actually far more pressing. Ultimately, the game that matters will play out at home rather than some far-off place like Iraq or Afghanistan. Whether the United States is able to shape the greater Middle East will matter less than whether it can reshape itself, restoring effectiveness to self-government, providing for sustainable and equitable prosperity, and extracting from a vastly diverse culture something to hold in common of greater moment than shallow digital enthusiasms and the worship of celebrity. Perpetuating the war for the greater Middle East is not enhancing American freedom, abundance, and security. If anything, it's having the opposite effect. One day, the American people may awaken to this reality, and then and only then will the war end. When this awakening will occur, however, is impossible to say. For now, sadly, Americans remain deep in slumber. Thank you very much. So I think we got about 20 or 25 minutes for comments and questions, and I welcome your reaction. And I think we're supposed to wait for the microphone to come to the questioner.
Do you think that the bringing back the draft as opposed to a voluntary service would be a fifth thing that would have an effect on the perpetual war?
Well, that's one of the ways that policymakers have insulated us from the effects of the war is by relying upon, and in my judgment, abusing and misusing the soldiers who do volunteer to serve. This is another one of these ironies of history. At the end of the Vietnam War, the American people chose to jettison the tradition of the citizen soldier, which had been the true cornerstone of American military policy since the days of the Revolution. In our anger and frustration with the Vietnam War, we cast that tradition aside. In essence, when President Nixon created the all-volunteer force, he was merely ratifying a decision that had been made collectively by the American people. So your question says, hey, can we undo that? Can we go back and reconstitute? When we talk about a draft, we're talking about reconstituting a citizen military in place of the standing army that we have today. I'm somewhat skeptical. I'm skeptical, first of all, because to the extent that the only way, the obvious way to reconstitute the citizen force is through conscription, it ain't going to happen. I mean, there is zero political support, I should say minimal political support for restoring the system of involuntary service. You know, the parents, the 19-year-olds of the country don't want it to happen, and parents of the 19-year-olds don't want it to happen. So the issue is an important one. My own sense is that for that issue to be taken seriously, we need to look for methods beyond conscription to accomplish the aim of bringing the people closer to military service and the effects of the war. I think a better alternative, at least to examine, is a system of national service. Many of you know what national service means. National service means everybody serves. Every 18-year-old in the country will spend a couple of years in service to the nation or to the community in one of a variety of options. One of those options might be join the Marine Corps. Another option might be do Teach for America, the Peace Corps, work in an old folks' home, a variety of things. I think that's something that deserves to be on our political agenda, at least as a matter of discussion. And again, I think it is a judgment on our politics that things like that are not discussed. That the assumption that the all-volunteer force is the proper military system for a democracy such as ours, that assumption goes unquestioned, even though there's plentiful evidence, especially since the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were initiated, that system does not serve the country or indeed the military itself very well.
You've been eloquent describing your position today and in your writings. So, 2 questions. What would you do in the United States, starting, let's say, with Afghanistan war, assuming that involvement in the Middle East is part of your objection to the U.S. policy? And let's assume that the incoming president pays the entire attention to the Far East, but does not practice containment and becomes just as aggressive, if you want, as the prior 3 presidents were in Middle East. So I'm trying to understand, are you against the policy of aggressive involvement, or the policy of aggressive involvement in the particular part of the world, which is Middle East?
Well, I'm opposed to stupid policies, and I'm in favor of prudent and pragmatic policies that produce positive results. As a historian, this is a history book. It's not a policy book. I mean, one can easily read my own policy preferences from the book, but this is a book that tries to tell the story of what the United States has done with its military in the Islamic world dating from 1980. My judgment is that the policies that we have followed have been counterproductive all along the way. That the conviction that the adroit use of American military power can somehow fix things is fundamentally flawed. And therefore, whatever solution there may be, whatever action that can be taken to advance our own interests, need to begin with the recognition of the imperative of demilitarizing our role. Now, we live in a society. We're a product of political discourse that when somebody says something like demilitarize, many people hearing that will say, aha, that's isolationism. That is to say, the assumption being that the only method of engaging in the world is by sending in U.S. troops and dropping American bombs. I reject that notion. It seems to me that there are other ways for us to engage in the Middle East with modest expectations with regard to our ability to fix things, but actually with some prospects of having a positive effect and of achieving that positive effect at a far, far lower cost to ourselves. What am I talking about? What I'm talking about is this. There is no question that ISIS poses an existential threat. It's just that it doesn't pose an existential threat to the United States of America. Actually, it poses a quite limited threat to the United States of America. ISIS poses an existential threat to who? Well, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all those various nations that reckless and arrogant Europeans created in the wake of World War I, after they chose to dismember the Ottoman Empire. Those are the nations that are threatened. It seems to me that those nations because they are threatened, because of where they are located, are actually much better situated than we are to deal with that threat. I mean, what is the ISIS threat? I haven't seen recent numbers. I imagine that the number of fighters is somewhere in the vicinity of 20, 25,000, probably. They have very few heavy weapons. To my knowledge, they have no air force. They have no navy. They have a very limited resource base. They have zero allies. They are vile killers, but their actual capacity to wage war is quite limited. And were Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, those nations directly threatened to collaborate with one another, I'd argue they could rather handily deal with the threat posed by ISIS. And the appropriate immediate response is, yes, but Iran and Iraq, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have various grievances with one another that date back a considerable period of time, are deep-seated. And so isn't it asking a lot for them to set aside their grievances in order to deal with this looming threat? And the answer is, sure, it's asking a lot, but we should ask it anyway. And heavens to Betsy, there are historical precedents. Let us recall the one with which we are most familiar, called World War II, when Great Britain, an imperial country committed to the preservation of its empire, and the seat of democratic capitalism, the United States of America, collaborated with Joseph Stalin's totalitarian Marxist-Leninist Soviet Union in order to defeat a common threat called Nazi Germany. We set aside our differences. It seems to be the diplomatic task, the task of diplomatic engagement, I don't mean to trivialize it, is to help those nations that are most directly threatened by ISIS to recognize that they have a common interest and need to act on that common interest to deal with the threat. Now, if somebody said to me, yes, but wouldn't it be much, much easier for the United States, with the most powerful military in the world, to deal with the threat? I would say, sure, if you can give me any evidence that U.S. military intervention is going to make things better than worse, I'm for it. But the problem is, again, this is the fourth Gulf War in which we've been engaged since 1980. The problem is the record shows that, definitively in my judgment, that U.S. military efforts, A, don't produce the success expected, and B, yield unintended consequences that make matters worse. So that's a long-winded answer to your question that came at it rather obliquely, but I hope it is satisfactory.
You just answered the first part.
Well, the second part of the question is what's going to happen if the next president decides that he's going to go intervene wildly in Asia in ways comparable to, well, I hope that doesn't happen. And B, if it does, then we're likely to end up in yet another pickle. I mean, I will not tell you that I know that I can define the aspirations of China over the next 20 or 50 or 100 years. I don't know that anybody can define those aspirations with accuracy. Quite frankly, my guess is that the Chinese leadership has not fully come to a conclusion about what they expect China's role in the world to be. I would say this, this is not a revelation. They are, and in all likelihood will continue to be, a great power. And we are going to have to share the planet with them, and they're going to have to share the planet with us. So the notion of an aggressive approach to aggressive containment that leads to hostilities between the United States and China will yield a catastrophe that will be comparable to some of the great catastrophes of the 20th century. And by the way, we'll find ourselves engaged in a war that we manifestly will not be able to win. I mean, occupying China, nation building in China, bringing China to see things our way. Those are preposterous propositions. So there is no, I am certainly persuaded that the China question is likely to be the question more than any other that determines whether or not in the 21st century we're able to avoid the catastrophes of the 20th century. It's a huge deal. And my only hope would be that regardless of who becomes president, they're sufficiently prudent to recognize that, courting a military showdown with the Chinese is not a good idea. Frankly, I think my guess is that most of the American officer corps, perhaps with the exception of the current commander of U.S. Pacific Command, that most of the American officer corps probably shares that view.
My name is Hong Liu. I have two questions for you. One question is, it seems to me there's a link between American, from president to the we ordinary citizens, our allegiance and the support of the state of Israel. And with American troops withdrawing from the Middle East, will the state of Israel still sustain or remain in existence? Number one. Number two.
Will it continue to exist?
Yes.
Okay.
Number two, I have been in this country for 30 years, but it seems to me there is a kind of media censorship or control, because when Iraqi war started, I was shocked. I never heard of the word war. I only hear the word Iraqi operation, Iraqi campaign. I'm wondering who is influencing whom, the media or our federal or government? Thanks.
Well, I don't have the same recollection that you do with regard to a media aversion to using the term war. I think the failure of the media was twofold. One, that too many reporters and too many editors bought into assumptions about American military supremacy that they ought to have questioned. They bought into the propaganda that nothing could stop the American military machine. If you buy into that notion, then what the heck? Why not invade Iraq? It's not going to be a problem. As one Washington type famously said in an op-ed in the Washington Post, it'll be a cakewalk. So too many people bought into this assumption about American military supremacy, and reporters, media types, and too few were skeptical about the case that the Bush administration was building with regard to the necessity of war, specifically related to the threat posed by Saddam Hussein and his putative weapons of mass destruction program. But I don't think that they were controlled. I think that they bought into a particular worldview. I think that reporters and editors were as horrified and angered and frightened by the events of 9/11 as the rest of us, and therefore felt that something needed to be done in order to prevent another 9/11. What we did was foolish, but there were failures in the level of reporting. First question was about Israel, and do I think Israel is going to survive and exist? Emphatically. I mean, and I say that because they are the most powerful country, without a doubt, by orders of magnitude in that part of the world. Yes, it's a teeny-weeny country, no question about it. It happens to be a teeny-weeny country with a very formidable military and, not least of all, nuclear weapons. I mean, that little laundry list that I ticked down that was trying to make the case that militarily ISIS is a fairly weak antagonist. You go down that same checklist, and what you get is an Israel that is that has spent the last 70 years acquiring military might and building a military system that will guarantee the security of Israel, and that's what they've done. So I'm not worried about the survival, nor, however, do I think that somehow Israel somehow controls U.S. foreign policy. There's no question that there is an Israel lobby. There's no question that the Israel lobby exerts considerable influence in our domestic politics. There's no questioning that to speak up forthrightly and to raise questions about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, you better be prepared to take some slings and arrows. It does not follow that the Israel lobby controls the U.S. policy. It does not follow that the narrative events that I try to describe in my book is a function of concerns for the security of Israel. That said, I mean, my view is that there's no question that the interests of the United States of America have long since diverged from the interests of the State of Israel as defined by the government of Israel, particularly the current government of Israel. You know, were I an Israeli Jew, I would have very little interest in pursuing a two-state solution. Because were I an Israeli Jew, I'd say, we're doing okay. Israel is a prosperous, democratic country. It's cohesive. It's got its problems, but all things considered, quite frankly, considering the history of Judaism in the West, Israel's a going concern. Why put it at risk by creating a sovereign Palestinian state as an immediate neighbor? But almost surely would create problems. Why do that? So were I an Israeli Jew, I'd be opposed to the peace process. But as an American, and I'm not Jewish, as an American, I believe that the United States of America has a profound interest in seeing the two-state solution come to pass. Why? Frankly, not because we care about Palestinians any more than any other Arabs care about Palestinians. It's an important interest. It's an important interest to us because we need to test the proposition that has been voiced over and over and over again, claiming that the root of anti-Western and anti-American sentiment in the Arab and the broader Islamic world derives from the perception that nobody cares about the grievances of the Palestinians. So we need to address the grievances of the Palestinians and either then, according to some, find antagonism toward the United States diminish, or find that that was not the case, and then we'll know that the problem is of a different sort.
So we have time. I see a lot of hands. We have time for just two more questions, and then we break. We probably want to save some time for mingling amongst ourselves, but also purchasing the book as well.
Thank you for speaking for us, Colonel Bacevich. Jimmy Carter said in 1980, and I will agree, he had a good point, that the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, was formed of vital U.S. interest. What do we need him for now? I mean, what vital interest is there? We're exporting oil. We could have done it years ago. But
well, I mean, I tried to imply the answer, at least in my little talk, and that is what we're in it for. I think is to a considerable degree almost psychic objectives. We're not willing to accept that. We're not willing to accept failure. We're not willing to accept that there are parts of the world that we cannot shape. We're not willing to accept that there are limits in the efficacy of American military power. For us to acknowledge the failure of the war for the greater Middle East would implicitly admit we're just a normal nation. We can't admit that. We are the exceptional nation. We are the indispensable nation. We are the nation that has a historic responsibility to accomplish history's essential purposes. That's, sadly, that notion, that thinking, is hardwired into our being and is certainly recited ad nauseum by politicians in Washington who seek our allegiance and our support. So it's very, very difficult at this stage of the game, having invested all that we've invested, for somebody to stand up and say, geez, the whole thing was a mistake.
The thing that bothers me is the way the United States quickly came into saying Assad should go in Syria, because supposedly they started killing their people at that time. I don't think anybody knew who started at that time. Yet on the other hand, in Turkey itself, they've killed over 30,000 Kurds, and they're doing it again now, yet we just cover it up. And it's a complete cover-up. This is disgusting. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure I would have said disgusting, maybe disgraceful. Yes, sir. I mean, anybody who is looking for consistency in U.S. policy is bound to be disappointed. Anybody who is looking for a common moral thread in U.S. policy is bound to be disappointed. Because you know what? We aren't the exceptional nation. We aren't. The claim that we are a great power, like that somehow is different from other great, that's not true. We are like other great powers. Not identical. Some have been worse. But ultimately, we're going to act in pursuit of our interests rather than concerns of right and wrong. The problem here, it seems to me, is that, particularly in this part of the world, we've had an exceedingly difficult time of seeing clearly where our interests lie. Were we able to do that, then I think that in some respects we could probably even avoid some of the sort of the dubious moral situations that we have been engaged in. Well, I thank you very much for the chance to talk to you and trying to respond to your excellent questions. Thank you.